And we're gonna kind of maybe temporarily conclude with our theme as far as moving from a buyer's market into a seller's market is concerned. That means identifying it, and then when you do, staying in it. And today, Ed is going to take us through maybe an important aspect of the topic. And I'm going to let Ed introduce the topic. So, Ed, over to you.
Thanks, Jacques. Good day, all. Um, yeah, we've been talking about buyers' markets and sellers' markets as if they were two very different things, and as if there was always a part of any market which was the seller's market, and all you had to do is to be smart enough to get into that, and then people would come running for your services. And if you weren't uh, very clever at that, then you'd be falling into a buyer's market where there were too many sellers and not enough buyers, and everyone was scrabbling for business. The reality is that there are some markets where it's entirely a buyer's market, where very few opportunities present themselves, and those that do are hotly contested. Let us, for instance, take the market for office space right now. Now we know that in the center of large cities that there's an awful lot of empty office space because of the pandemic and because of the culture of people working from home, some of whom have never returned to the office and probably never will. They will continue to be telecommuters. Um, and so there are quite big chunks of empty office space. Now, if your business is marketing office space, who's going to rent office space right now when everybody is shedding office space? That's a real buyer's market. If you did want to rent office space, you would go around to everyone who had office space and bargain, and you'd probably get some very, very good bargains indeed right now. Now, what do you do if you're the vendor of that office space? We can think of other things like retail space in many of the shopping centres where they're closed shops or very high value items that the uh, buyers have dropped because of financial considerations, because of the state of the economy and the state of people's finances following the pandemic. Whereas before they would have, a certain number of luxuries, perhaps holidays, perhaps luxury foods, perhaps beauty treatments or something like that, and they've just pulled their horns in and said, no, we can't do that anymore. Now, if you're marketing those holidays and there's nobody buying those holidays, then you are in a buyer's market. And if you're there, and it's usually fairly easy to identify when you are, although many people would say, oh, it's a buyer's market, nobody's buying. And then you look around and lots and lots of people are buying. Um, it's just that they're not finding the buyers. And we see numerous examples of that. If you're selling high end cars, I've heard a lot of times of people saying, well, there's just no market at that end of the market at all. Nobody's buying. And then you get the statistics, and there have been a large number of Porsches and perhaps even Ferraris and Maseratis and all sorts of other very high end cars sold during the last month. So the market was there, the vendor just hadn't seen it. But if there is realistically very little market, and we could do this in terms of the statistics on a lot of these things, like rentable office space, we could actually measure and say how many sales are happening there. And we'd probably find it's pretty low. So if you're in there, what do you do? Well, you have a couple of choices. Your first choice is just nothing. Hang in there. So long as you're surviving and you are putting food on the table and you're paying your staff and you're able to afford to do that, then one of the good examples, just nothing, do nothing, stay there, hang in. Maybe it'll turn around at some stage in the future because there is, as the population grows, there will be and as the economy grows, there will be a need for increased office space. You might have to tough it out for a couple of years, though. Usually, though, if you take that hang in there option, you have to cut back on your costs, and that could easily be retrenchments. And we won't do everything in our power now to avoid retrenchments. We already have this incredibly high unemployment rate. We don't need to add to that. We know that jobs are very scarce, and people you retrench may never work again in their lives. So, be very careful of taking that step. But that's the one option. You can do the hang in there. The second option is that you can simply slash prices, that you can cut the prices to the bone, even at cost, and rather occupy the empty space so that at least it's not costing you anything, even if you don't make any profit out of it. You will then get tenants and you will get references from tenants. The building won't be as empty as it was previously, and so on down the line. Now, I know some time ago, an owner of a building in downtown Johannesburg, where the building, it was a 5-story building, I think, and the owner, the tenants had moved out because the degradation of the area around where this building was. Um, the front door of the building was bricked up to avoid being taken over by squatters, and it was a basket case. It was a large building, and it was uh, going nowhere. And some creative people put together a deal where a company bought the building for a very small amount of money and simply didn't have a pedestrian entrance into the building. Everything was via the garage, the underground garage. So they had a high security gate on the entrance to the building, and they refurbished the interior of the building, and they were very happy. They lived there perfectly peaceably. It didn't matter what was happening in their surroundings. They were safe inside their building, and it was very economical for them to work. And the business expanded and it grew and it took over a couple of floors. And, today that building's worth an enormous amount of money. So there are some creative ways of doing it, even if you do so at cost. So that's the second option. That option seems not to be favored by people who market space. They're not really too keen to reduce the price perceptions of what space actually costs. So it seems that in many instances they'd rather leave the space empty than reduce price there. I think there's some other markets where people want to keep the price high in order to keep up the perception of value. And so they are very reluctant to cut prices. And, that option might not be available to them. And then the third option is to try and do something different completely. Now, my best example of this happened an enormously long time ago, probably before any of us were born, including me. And that's a long time ago. Somewhere in the 1950s or so, the, the estate agents, or the early 60s, the estate agents in Johannesburg almost had a joke between them that whenever a new agent joined their company, they were given the territory of a suburb in the east of Johannesburg called Kensington. And Kensington was the graveyard of estate agents because nothing ever happened in Kensington. It was the absolute buyer's mark. The style of the community in Kensington was very family orientated. Um, People were born in a house and they died in a house, and they left that to their sons or perhaps daughters. And so you frequently had a situation where you'd have a family that inherited the house from, say, the husband's father, and they brought up their children in that house. And as they aged, the children, if they were male, would marry and bring their brides back to that house and perhaps have children there. And you often had three generations occupying the same house. And they're tiny little houses. And so this estate agent went in there all bright eyed and bushy tailed and waiting to make a million. And he found this scene of absolute devastation. The only time anyone ever sold a house in Kensington was typically out of a deceased estate where there were either no heirs or the heirs didn't want the house, and that was a rarity. And then usually it would be bought up by another Kensington resident. And so the cycle would go on. And he had to spend 2 years there of his sort of apprenticeship. And he rapidly realized that in 2 years he was not going to eat a lot. He was certainly not going to make any money. And he was an ambitious and impatient young man. So he said he had to do something about that. Now remember, this is the age long before personal computers, cell phones, Google Maps, databases, spreadsheets, and all of the other tools that we so enjoy today. So what he did was he started to visit houses in Kensington. And in each house, he introduced himself, told people about how he was there to serve them, asked them about their house and their family, and then went and created a little index card. You know, these 3x5, as they're called, index cards, white lined cards that used to be a staple part of business. He would
Hmm.
go and he'd put down the address of the house, all in handwriting, of course, and the names of the occupants and the number of the occupants and their approximate ages, and then the outline of the house. How many bedrooms did it have? All the houses in Kensington pretty well had one bathroom. Did it have a garage? Did it have more than one garage? And that sort of thing. And he gradually, over a period of time, visited every house in the whole of Kensington. It's quite a big suburb, many hundreds of houses. And he had this collection, this database in today's terms, all handwritten and all on index cards. And that's when he realized that things did change in Kensington. It just wasn't obvious. So he started to now look for change. And change came in the form of, for instance, death notices. It came in the form of marriage notices. It came in the form of uh, new babies being christened in the local churches. It came in the form of students joining or leaving school. And each time an event like that happened, and he studied everything, he knew all of the churches, he knew all of the schools, he knew every funeral director and everything else in the whole of that operated in that suburb. And every time there was a change, he noted it. And then he started to see a pattern developing. So on the one side, there would be a family that, for instance, may have had two sons and a daughter, and all three had married. The daughter moved in with her husband wherever he was. The two sons brought their wives home, and perhaps both of them had children. And now this little two or three bedroomed house was bulging at the seams. It was far too small. There were cars parked in the road outside and in the yard, and it was far too small for people. And on the other side of the road, there was uh, a couple who'd only had daughters. The daughters had married and moved out, and they now had this quite substantial three-bedroomed house with two garages, and they were rattling around in it. They had far too much space. And gradually over time, he managed to pair these kind of instances together. So he would go along to the two parties, ask the party where they were bulging at the seam whether they would consider looking at a bigger house, and it was in Kensington because that would have to have been a consideration. And then he'd go along to the couple living on their own and say, would they consider downsizing to a smaller house? It would save them money, and there wouldn't be so much cleaning and so on to do. And of course, many of these things happened. So he swapped the two parties across. Quite cleverly, because he was getting commission on both ends of the sale. And,
Wow.
and so successful was he in doing this that at the end of his 2 year tenure, when he was offered a lucrative suburb because he was doing very well, he's obviously a very competent estate agent. When he was offered a lucrative suburb as his territory, he refused. He said, "Oh, no, making far too much money in Kensington to move out of here." And this had been the graveyard of every estate agent in the country. Now, the serious part about that story is how dedicated he was in understanding his market. And with none of the tools that we have today. We could have done that using Google Earth and probably a Facebook check and a few other things, and got most of that data and put it in an electronic database that had it match for us automatically. But he had to do that all manually. He had to juggle it all around in his head and on his index cards. Now that's dedication. And yes, it was probably 60 or 70 years ago. So maybe he had more time in those days than we do today. But the message behind it is that he really got to understand his market, and he looked for the smallest of change. And where there's change, there's opportunity. So if you take that example and then you look at buyer behavior, and there's a hierarchy of buyer behavior, how buyers get to buy, then you'll find that very typically all purchases happen because something changes. So the first step is that something changes, the old car breaks down, the house becomes too full for you, or too too big for you, um, whatever. You look for change, and then you have to consider the next step is consider what you want to do about it. Do you want to actually change it? Do you want to modify things? Do you want to take a different tack? Do you want to turn half the house into a B&B? Do you want to get your old car fixed, or should you replace it? And only then do you start actually shopping for goods once you've gone through those two cycles. But very important, the first step along the line is to look for change. Now, that's something which businesses and sales teams often miss these days. Looking for something that changes, because almost every change generates an opportunity. Because at some stage in the future, there will be purchases arising from that change. If you look at
Ed,
something like, yeah,
just a quick clarification. Is this change that you're talking about, whenever you use that word, the words that sort of associate itself with a change is changing needs. And because in the an example that you shared, a brilliant example of the Kensington area,
mm,
is because he studied and collected information and data about the suburb, he could spot the changing needs, and it's and then be able to sell and encourage. He sees the need, because sometimes it's like and I'm not sure if I'm correct, Ed, you can help me here. Is it's sometimes, we live our lives as consumers, and and then we just kind of absorb the changes in our lives, right, without thinking about, but our needs are different, we need to make a change. And what he did so successfully was see that there is a new need being created, even though the consumers did not necessarily start looking elsewhere. He created, or he was able to articulate this need, and therefore articulated the problem and then met the problem with a solution. I don't know. That's kind of what I see.
Very, very much so, Jacques. In fact, what he was doing, if you looked at modern terminology, he was exploiting or identifying a latent need. Because these
Yeah.
people, it was a very stable community. They just didn't do things like moving houses. Um, Once he pointed out the advantages of doing that, suddenly the need became an apparent need, not just a latent need.
Mm,
So he
mm,
looked for change, but it's not just change per se. That information was readily available. The newspapers used to publish columns of births and marriages and deaths every day. So that
mm-hmm,
sort of information was widely available. Um, but no one thought to associate that with opportunity because they didn't have the database. So that change was just meaningless.
mm,
So someone died. So what?
mm,
Um, Now, if you had the data behind it, you would understand the implications of that death or that marriage or that birth. Um, and he fortunately, well, wisely, had the data behind it. So it wasn't just change. Change is often very obvious. I mean, we don't have to look far for change in the last couple of years. There's massive changes everywhere.
mm,
But it's
mm.
the change that drives a need,
Yeah.
even if it's a latent need, that we need
Mm,
to look at. And we can identify change very readily. Yeah? In 10 minutes on a search engine, and you'll have thousands and thousands of things that have changed.
mm,
Some of them in the last microsecond.
mm,
Um, does it make any sense to you? Well, no, not unless you put it in context and see where you can use that change. But if you are putting it into context, I will guarantee that there are changes in patterns in, for instance, the area of office space. I've no idea where they are because that's not my field. But I would guarantee that they're there, that there are changes, even if nobody recognizes them, that are probably identifiable as opportunities for the future of creating latent needs and so on. And the change might not necessarily be related to office rentals, might be related to something like population growth or urbanization or
mm,
centralization of or conversion of the economy from a mining and manufacturing to an intellectual um, white collar type economy, which will drive people out of factories and into offices. So it might be change which is not right in the middle of what you're doing. This estate agent didn't look for change when he started out. He just wanted to get to know the whole of the suburb because he knew he had to live there for 2 years, and he felt that if he really knew his territory, he would be able to do that. So, yeah, change, the change that happens, not every change drives a purchase. Very few purchases are driven without there being a change. So just the fact that there's change does not necessarily mean that there's a purchase. But if you backtrack just about every purchase, And, let's think of our own lives. Why did we buy the latest car, PC, laptop, furniture, appliance, house, job, studies, or whatever? What
Mm.
changed? And all of them, if we think back, will probably be triggered by some kind of a change. It might be a change in our lifestyle. It might be an opportunity change. Suddenly I got a lucky break and I don't know, got a refund from the taxman. I had the money to go and do whatever I wanted to do with it. So if you are stuck in that kind of buyer's market alone, one of the best solutions, and it's the third, remember there were two others. The one is you can cut your prices to the bone, and the converse of that, you can increase your value um, disproportionately to the price. So you might, in that circumstance, have thrown in all new drywalling and carpeting or tiling or something like that. Or you might have added to that space um, free, very high speed Wi Fi or something like that. So you could make the space disproportionately valued to the comparable rentals around you. Or you could cut the price right back to the bone. Doesn't matter which way around you do it. So that was the one alternative. The other was doing nothing. And the third alternative was to really understand your market and the nuances of what's happening at your market far beyond the immediate market and then look for change somewhere in this and see where there are opportunities involved in that. So, quite a complex situation, and too many people find them stuck and they just take the first alternative. We're just going to sit here and we will complain bitterly that there is no market, that we can't make any money, there are no jobs, and it doesn't matter whether what side of the spectrum you're from, there are no jobs, you can't make money as an entrepreneur or whatever. And there's so many stories that tell you that that's untrue, completely
Mm.
untrue. Heard a beautiful story just during this week of two brothers who set up a business. They're both skilled in their field, and it's a business in motor engineering, and they're both very skilled at that. And they set up their business. They decided to leave their jobs and go and set up their business, and they did that 3 years ago. Great timing. Straight into the 2019 depression and then the 2020 and 2021 pandemic lockdown. Great business. Great timing. But they went into this business and they're good at what they do and they were clever at where they look for sales. And um, in 3 years from zero, from a small amount of savings that they had, which bought their basic machinery and paid the deposit on the rent and that sort of thing. The one brother tells me he now has, his share in the business is worth R1 million. 3 years from nowhere. And this happened in the worst possible circumstances, in the worst set of conditions possible. And there's a company that's expanded its premises twice during that 3 years and employs quite a number of people. So it can be done. Can be done if you have the skills and you have the smarts and you think and you don't think negatively. You think on the positive spectrum. Then there's lots of opportunity around, even in buyers markets.
Wow, thank you, Ed. Time has flown by as usual.
Mm,
And I tell you, my takeaway from today is you find yourself in a buyer's market. It is what it is. But um, ask yourself, do I know this market that I'm in? Do I really understand its characteristics? Do I understand its behavior fully? And then collect the data,
mm,
put the psychographics together, and Then the intelligence part is to analyze, because in the analysis of what you're seeing, in that change, and particularly then spotting latent needs, then being able to define a problem and therefore offer a solution and turn that into a sale. This is my takeaway for
Yeah.
today, Ed.
I think you've got it 100% right, Jacques. Or you can sit and complain.
Mm,
Your choice.
mm. Wonderful. Well, as usual, some wonderful bits and pieces of wisdom coming through. And we just, to our listeners, if you do nothing, if you don't even take what we are saying as inspiration, well, your situation is not going to change, even though you expect different things. So until next week, have a good week. Try new things. Understand where you're at. Understand your potential market. Then spend the time analyzing it. So until next week then.